Chapter 4 of Barnaby Rudge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens. Chapter 4. In the venerable suburb, it was a suburb once, of Clerkenwell, towards that part of its confines which is nearest to the Charterhouse, and in one of those cool, shady streets, of which a few, widely scattered and dispersed, yet remain in such old parts of the metropolis, each tenement quietly vegetating like an ancient citizen, who long ago retired from business, and dozing on in its infirmity until in course of time it tumbles down, and is replaced by some extravagant young heir, flaunting in stucco and ornamental work, and all the vanities of modern days. In this quarter, and in a street of this description, the business of the present chapter lies. At the time of which it treats, though only 66 years ago, a very large part of what is London now had no existence. Even in the brains of the wildest speculators there had sprung up no long rows of streets connecting Highgate with Whitechapel, no assemblages of palaces in the swampy levels, nor little cities in the open fields. Although this part of town was then, as now, parcelled out in streets and plentifully peopled, it wore a different aspect. There were gardens to many of the houses, and trees by the pavement side, with an air of freshness breathing up and down, which in these days would be sought in vain. Fields were nigh at hand, through which the New River took its winding course, and where there was merry haymaking in the summer-time. Nature was not so far removed or hard to get at as in these days, and although there were busy trades in Clerkenwell, and working jewellers by scores, it was a purer place, with farmhouses nearer to it than many modern Londoners would readily believe, and lovers' walks at no great distance, which turned into squalid courts long before the lovers of this age were born, or, as the phrase goes, thought of. In one of these streets, the cleanest of them all, and on the shady side of the way, for good housewives know that sunlight damages their cherished furniture, and so choose the shade rather than its intrusive glare, there stood the house with which we have to deal. It was a modest building, not very straight, not large, not tall, not bold-faced with great staring windows, but a shy, blinking house with a conical roof going up into a peak over its garret window of 4 small panes of glass, like a cocked hat on the head of an elderly gentleman with one eye. It was not built of brick or lofty stone, but of wood and plaster. It was not planned with a dull and wearisome regard to regularity, for no one window matched the other, or seemed to have the slightest reference to anything besides itself. The shop, for it had a shop, was with reference to the first floor, where shops usually are, and there all resemblance between it and any other shop stopped short and ceased. People who went in and out didn't go up a flight of steps to it, or walk easily in upon a level with the street, but dived down 3 steep stairs, as into a cellar. Its floor was paved with stone and brick, as that of any other cellar might be, and in lieu of window, framed and glazed, it had a great black wooden flap or shutter, nearly breast-high from the ground, which turned back in the daytime, admitting as much cold air as light, and very often more. Behind this shop was a wainscoted parlour, looking first into a paved yard, and beyond that again into a little terrace garden, raised some feet above it. Any stranger would have supposed that this wainscoted parlour, saving for the door of communication by which he had entered, was cut off and detached from all the world; and indeed most strangers on their first entrance were observed to grow extremely thoughtful, as weighing and pondering in their minds whether the upper rooms were only approachable by ladders from without, never suspecting that 2 of the most unassuming and unlikely doors in existence, which the most ingenious mechanician on earth must of necessity have supposed to be the doors of closets, opened out of this room, each without the smallest preparation, or so much as a quarter of an inch of passage, upon 2 dark winding flights of stairs, the one upward, the other downward, which were the sole means of communication between that chamber and the other portions of the house. With all these oddities there was not a neater, more scrupulously tidy, or more punctiliously ordered house. In Clerkenwell, in London, in all England. There were not cleaner windows, or whiter floors, or brighter stoves, or more highly shining articles of furniture in old mahogany. There was not more rubbing, scrubbing, burnishing, and polishing in the whole street put together. Nor was this excellence attained without some cost and trouble and great expenditure of voice, as the neighbours were frequently reminded when the good lady of the house overlooked and assisted in its being put to rights on cleaning days, which were usually from Monday morning till Saturday night, both days inclusive. Leaning against the door-post of this, his dwelling, the locksmith stood early on the morning after he had met with the wounded man, gazing disconsolately at a great wooden emblem of a key, painted in vivid yellow to resemble gold, which dangled from the house front and swung to and fro with a mournful creaking noise, as if complaining that it had nothing to unlock. Sometimes he looked over his shoulder into the shop, which was so dark and dingy with numerous tokens of his trade, and so blackened by the smoke of a little forge near which his prentice was at work, that it would have been difficult for one unused to such espials to have distinguished anything but various tools of uncouth make and shape, great bunches of rusty keys, fragments of iron, half-finished locks, and such like things, which garnished the walls and hung in clusters from the ceiling. After a long and patient contemplation of the golden key and many such backward glances, Gabriel stepped into the road and stole a look at the upper windows. One of them chanced to be thrown open at the moment, and a roguish face met his, a face lighted up by the loveliest pair of sparkling eyes that ever locksmith looked upon, the face of a pretty laughing girl, dimpled and fresh and healthful, the very impersonation of good humour and blooming beauty. "Hush!" she whispered, bending forward and pointing archly to the window underneath. "Mother is still asleep." "Still, my dear," returned the locksmith in the same tone. "You talk as if she had been asleep all night, instead of little more than half an hour. But I'm very thankful. Sleep's a blessing, no doubt about it." The last few words he muttered to himself. "How cruel of you to keep us up so late this morning and never tell us where you were or send us word," said the girl. "Ah, Dolly, Dolly," returned the locksmith, shaking his head and smiling, "how cruel of you to run upstairs to bed! Come down to breakfast, madcap, and come down lightly, or you'll wake your mother. She must be tired, I am sure, I am." Keeping these latter words to himself, and returning his daughter's nod, he was passing into the workshop with the smile she had awakened still beaming on his face, when he just caught sight of his prentice's brown paper cap ducking down to avoid observation, and shrinking from the window back to its former place, which the wearer no sooner reached than he began to hammer lustily. "Listening again, Simon?" said Gabriel to himself. "That's bad. What in the name of wonder does he expect the girl to say, that I always catch him listening when she speaks, and never at any other time? A bad habit, Sim, a sneaking underhanded way. Ah, you may hammer, but you won't beat that out of me if you work at it till your time's up." So saying, and shaking his head gravely, he re-entered the workshop, and confronted the subject of these remarks. "There's enough of that just now," said the locksmith. "You needn't make any more of that confounded clatter. Breakfast's ready." "Sir," said Sim, looking up with amazing politeness and a peculiar little bow cut short off at the neck, "I shall attend you immediately." "I suppose," muttered Gabriel, "that's out of the 'Prentice's Garland, or the 'Prentice's Delight, or the 'Prentice's Warbler, or the 'Prentice's Guide to the Gallows, or some such improving textbook. Now he's going to beautify himself. Here's a precious locksmith!" Quite unconscious that his master was looking on from the dark corner by the parlour door, Sim threw off the paper cap, sprang from his seat, and in two extraordinary steps, something between skating and minuet dancing, bounded to a washing-place at the other end of the shop, and there removed from his face and hands all traces of his previous work, practising the same step all the time with the utmost gravity. This done, he drew from some concealed place a little scrap of looking-glass, and with its assistance arranged his hair and ascertained the exact state of a little carbuncle on his nose. Having now completed his toilette, he placed the fragment of mirror on a low bench, and looked over his shoulder at so much of his legs as could be reflected in that small compass, with the greatest possible complacency and satisfaction. Sim, as he was called in the locksmith's family, or Mr. Simon Tappertit, as he called himself, and required all men to style him out of doors, on holidays and Sundays out, was an old-fashioned, thin-faced, sleek-haired, sharp-nosed, small-eyed little fellow, very little more than 5 feet high, and thoroughly convinced in his own mind that he was above the middle